My name is Walter Hensley, and for 30 years I believed that the harder a man worked, the safer his family would be. I learned too late that the two have nothing to do with each other. It started with a single truck, a rusted Ford I borrowed from a man named Cole who ran a hardware store and took a chance on a 29-year-old with more ambition than sense. I poured concrete in the freezing dawn and framed houses until my hands cracked and bled, and every night I came home to a small apartment where my wife, Ruth, would wrap my knuckles in gauze and tell me it would be worth it someday. She believed in me before there was anything to believe in. When Hensley Construction finally became a name people in this county said with respect, she was the one who cried, "Not me. I was too busy already dreaming about the next job. We had 3 children." Marcus was the oldest, sharp and charming, the kind of boy who could talk his way out of anything. Then came Dana, quieter, the one who used to ride along in the truck with me on Saturdays, and finally Sean, the baby, who I probably spoiled more than the others because by then we had the money to. I built that company for them, every 14-hour day, every missed birthday, every anniversary I spent bidding on a contract instead of holding my wife's hand. I justified it all by telling myself I was building something they could inherit. A legacy, a foundation that would keep them standing long after I was gone. Ruth passed 6 years ago, cancer, quick and merciless, and after that the company became something more than a business to me. It became the last thing she and I had made together that was still alive. Marcus came to me in the spring. He was 38 then, married to a woman named Celeste, and he sat across from me at my kitchen table with that same charming smile he'd had as a boy. He told me the company needed to modernize, that the industry was changing, that I'd earned my rest, that I should step back and let the next generation carry the weight while I finally enjoyed my life. He said it so gently, so lovingly, that I felt my chest tighten with pride. My son wanted to protect me. My son wanted to honor what I'd built by carrying it forward. I remember I reached across that table and squeezed his hand and told him I was proud of the man he'd become. God help me, I meant it. The papers came a week later. A thick folder, tabs marking where I should sign, and Marcus flipping through them casually, explaining that it was all restructuring, tax efficiency, protecting the family assets. He used words I didn't fully understand and trusted him to understand for me, because he was my son, because I had raised him, because it never once occurred to me that the boy I taught to ride a bike would look me in the eye and lie. I signed every page. I didn't call my own lawyer. Why would I need a lawyer to protect me from my own child? That question still keeps me awake some nights. I signed my life's work over to him and thanked him for taking care of his old man. What those papers actually did was transfer my controlling shares into a holding company. A holding company Marcus had quietly formed months earlier, with Celeste listed as co-owner. My daughter-in-law, a woman I had welcomed into my home, whose wedding I had paid for, who had sat at my table every Christmas and called me Dad. The two of them had built the trap slowly, patiently, and I had walked into it smiling, holding the pen they handed me. The board meeting was in June. I still went to the office most mornings, out of habit more than authority, and that day the secretary told me there was a meeting I should attend. I walked into the conference room I had designed myself in, with the long oak table I'd had made from timber off our first big job, and I found it full of strangers, men in expensive suits, lawyers, a woman with a folder who wouldn't meet my eyes, and At the head of the table, in my chair, sat Marcus, Celeste beside him, Dana and Sean further down, and neither of them looked up at me. Marcus stood and thanked me. Thanked me for my years of service, said the board had voted, and that my presence was no longer required in the operational leadership of the company. Those were his words, no longer required, as if I were a subcontractor whose bid had come in too high. I stood there in the doorway, 62 years old, and I felt the floor I had literally helped pour tilt beneath me. I looked at Dana, my Saturday girl, and she stared at the table. I looked at Sean, my baby, and he studied his hands. Nobody spoke for me. Nobody stood. The children I had bled for sat in silence while strangers dismantled me, and the silence was worse than anything Marcus said. The silence told me everything. They had all known. Every one of them had known and chosen not to warn me. I don't remember driving home. I remember sitting in the dark of my living room, Ruth's photograph on the mantel catching what little light came through the window, and I remember being grateful she wasn't alive to see it. That was the worst part, honestly. Not the loss of the company, the loss of the belief that I had raised good people. For 30 years I had told myself that all the sacrifice, all the missed moments, had been worth it because I was giving my children everything. And they had taken everything and left me sitting alone in the dark. For 3 days I grieved like a man grieves a death. And then, on the 4th day, sitting at that same kitchen table where I'd signed my life away, I remembered something. I got up and I went to the old filing cabinet in my study, the one Marcus's fancy lawyers had never thought to look through, because why would they? And there it was. The land, when I'd started building the company, back when I couldn't afford much, I'd bought the parcels of land myself, personally, one at a time, long before there was ever a corporation. Over the years, as the company grew, it built its warehouses, its equipment yards, its main offices, and yes, its biggest current development, a 90-unit residential project that was the future of the whole business, all on that land. But the land had never belonged to the company. It belonged to me, Walter Hensley, personally, and the company simply leased it from me under an agreement I had drawn up decades ago and renewed by hand every few years. A personal agreement, one that only I could sign, and the current lease, and I saw as I ran my finger down the page with a hand that had finally stopped shaking, was set to expire in 11 weeks. I didn't call anyone. I didn't rage. I had learned rage from my own father, and it had never built a single thing. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I waited, and I let the work reveal itself. And the renewal paperwork would need my signature to keep that 90-unit development on schedule. And without that development delivering on time, the loans Marcus had leveraged to buy me out would come due with nothing to pay them. He had bet the whole company on land he didn't own. In his hunger to take everything, he had forgotten to check whether the ground itself was his. The first call came from the company's new attorney, polite, professional, asking me to sign a routine lease renewal at my earliest convenience. I told him I'd think it over. A week passed. Then Marcus called, and his voice had that old charm in it, warm and easy, telling me he hoped we could put our misunderstanding behind us, that family was family. I let him talk. I didn't sign. Another week, and the calls came faster, the charm draining out of them, replaced by something tighter. The development had stalled. Contractors were idle. Interest was accruing. Investors were nervous. Then Dana came to my house, my Saturday girl, standing on my porch with red eyes, and she told me the truth Marcus never would. that he had pressured her and Sean into signing off on the buyout, that Celeste had been the architect of the whole thing, that they'd been told I was getting senile and needed to be eased out for my own good, a lie that made my stomach turn. She said she'd known it was wrong the moment I walked into that conference room and no one stood up. She said she'd been ashamed every day since, and then she asked me not to destroy them. I looked at my daughter for a long time, and I told her the truth, which is that I had never wanted to destroy anyone. I wanted them to feel the ground move the way I had felt it move, and standing in that doorway. I wanted Marcus to understand, just for a moment, what it was to build your life on something and watch it dissolve beneath you. But I was not my son. I would not leave my own children in the dark. I signed the lease, but not the one they wanted. I had my own lawyer, a real one this time, draw up new terms. The land would be placed into a trust, controlled by me during my lifetime and divided fairly among all three of my children after, with Marcus's share held in conditions that made it impossible for him to ever again move a single asset without his siblings' agreement. The company survived, barely, but only because I let it. Marcus kept his title. He also kept, every single day, the knowledge that the man he'd tried to erase had held his entire future in one unsigned page and chosen mercy. That knowledge, I think, weighs more than any revenge I could have taken. Celeste left him within the year. People like her only stay while there's something to take. Marcus and I are not close now, and maybe we never will be again, but he calls on Sundays, and his voice is humbler than it used to be. Dana comes by every Saturday, like she did when she was small, and sometimes we just sit on the porch and don't say much at all. Sean is trying in his clumsy way to earn back something he threw away too cheaply. I turned 65 last month. I don't run the company anymore, and I've made my peace with that. What I've learned is that a legacy isn't a building or a business or a name on a truck. It's whether the people you leave behind know the difference between taking and earning. My children forgot that, for a while. I made sure they remembered. Justice, I've learned, doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to burn anything down. It only needs to be patient, and it needs to be earned back, the same way everything worth having always is. And my name is Eleanor Whitfield, and for 8 years, I mistook being used for being needed. There is a difference, though it took a room full of laughter for me to finally see it. I raised my son Daniel alone after his father left us when Daniel was 9. I worked 2 jobs, cleaned offices at night, and still managed to sit at the kitchen table and help him with his homework even when my eyes could barely stay open. I did it gladly. I would do it again. Everything I sacrificed, because I believed that if I gave my son enough love, enough support, enough of myself, he would grow into a man who understood what those things cost. For a long time, Ed and I told myself he had Daniel married Vanessa 12 years ago. She was beautiful in the way that makes people forgive things they shouldn't, polished and certain, Ed from a family that had money and never let you forget it. I wanted so badly to be liked by her. I brought gifts when I visited. I complimented her taste. I told myself that her coolness toward me was just her nature, that warmth would come with time. It never did, but I kept reaching for it anyway. The way you keep reaching for a light switch in a room you know has no power. When they wanted to buy their house, a beautiful thing in a neighborhood far beyond what Daniel's salary could carry, I gave them the down payment, $62,000, most of what I had saved for my own retirement, drawn from the account I'd built one exhausted paycheck at a time. And I did it because Daniel sat in my living room and told me he was drowning, that Vanessa was disappointed in him, that this house would fix everything. I couldn't bear the shame in his voice, and so I wrote the check. But I was not a foolish woman, whatever they came to think of me. I had spent too many years counting pennies to hand over that much without a record. And I had a lawyer draw up a proper loan agreement, documented and signed, and I did the same every single time after, for the private school tuition when their daughters enrolled, and for the car when Vanessa decided the old one embarrassed her, for the 2 failed businesses Daniel poured money into, money that was mine. Each time, papers. Each time, signatures. I never made a show of it. I told them it was just formality, just bookkeeping. They signed without reading, because to them I was not a person who could ever call a debt. I was just Mom. I was just there, and every Sunday, for 8 years I cooked. I arrived at their house in the early afternoon, and I made the dinner Vanessa served to whoever she wanted to impress that week. And I ironed Daniel's shirts because Vanessa said she didn't have the patience for it. I watched my granddaughters when their nanny had the weekend off, which was often. And I did the small invisible labor that holds a household together, the labor no one thanks you for, because they don't even see it happening. I told myself this was love, and I told myself a mother doesn't keep score, and I meant it, right up until the evening I learned that they had been keeping score all along, and I was losing a game I hadn't known I was playing. And it was a dinner party. Vanessa had invited her friends, women with the same polished certainty, and their husbands, and she wanted everything perfect. And I spent the whole day in that kitchen preparing a meal I had cooked 100 times, and when the guests arrived, I stayed by the stove, plating, serving, refilling glasses. One of the women, kind-eyed, asked Vanessa who I was, gesturing toward me as I set down a dish of roasted lamb, and Vanessa smiled that bright, practiced smile and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, that I was the help who comes on weekends. She said it lightly, like a joke, and the table laughed, polite, careless laughter, but the laugh that broke something in me was Daniel's. And my son laughed loudest of all. The boy I'd sung to sleep, the boy I'd gone hungry for so he could eat, sat at that table in a house I paid for and laughed while his wife erased me in front of strangers. I did not drop the dish. I did not cry. Something in me went very still and very clear, and the way the air goes still before a storm turns. I set the lamb down gently in the center of the table. I smiled at the kind-eyed woman, and I finished serving. I stayed until the meal was done. And as I drove home that night, my hands steady on the wheel, I made a decision that 8 years of swallowed hurt had finally earned. That Sunday would be my last. I was done being invisible. But more than that, I was done being generous to people who mistook my generosity for weakness. The first thing I did that Monday was call my lawyer. Not out of rage, but out of a cold, tired clarity. I asked him to formally call in the loans, all of them, the down payment, the tuition, the car, the business money, every documented dollar, plus the modest interest the agreements specified. It came to just over $200,000. My lawyer asked me, gently, if I was certain, because these were my son and his family. I told him yes. I told him that respect, when you have to buy it back, was never really respect at all. I stopped the monthly transfers first, and for years I'd quietly been covering the gap between what they earned and the life they insisted on living. A few $1,000s a month sliding into their account like water into cracks they never bothered to seal. When the water stopped, the cracks showed fast. The tuition bill went unpaid, and the private school sent notices. The car payment lapsed. Vanessa's credit cards, which I later learned were carrying balances I'd been unknowingly subsidizing, began to strain. And then came the formal letter from my lawyer laying out the debts, the signed agreements, the timeline for repayment. And I imagine that was the moment the ground truly opened beneath them. Vanessa called me first, and her voice had none of its usual polish. She was furious, then frightened, then absurdly wounded, as if I had betrayed her by simply asking for what was mine. She said family didn't do this to family. I let the irony of that sit in the silence before I answered, and I told her that a family member was exactly what I had been every Sunday for 8 years, and that she had introduced me to a room full of strangers as the help. I told her the help gets paid, and I never had, so perhaps it was time to settle accounts properly. Then I hung up. Her friends, the ones who had laughed, evaporated the moment the money did. And people like that gather around comfort and scatter at the first sign of trouble. The dinner parties stopped. The invitations dried up. Vanessa's certainty, which had always been built on the appearance of wealth rather than the fact of it, cracked as her carefully arranged life came apart. And through it all, I felt no joy. That surprised me, and I had expected to feel vindicated, triumphant even. Instead, I felt only a deep, aching sadness for the years I had given to people who had valued me at nothing. It was 3 weeks before Daniel came to my door. Not the confident man who had laughed at that table. He stood on my porch looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his eyes red, his shoulders bent, and for a moment I saw the 9-year-old boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. He said he didn't know how everything had gotten so far. He said Vanessa had always made him feel that leaning on me was normal, that I had plenty, that I liked being needed. He said he was sorry, and then he asked me, in a broken voice, why I was doing this to him. I invited him in. I made him tea the way I used to, and I sat across from my son and I told him the truth I had spent 8 years too afraid to say. And I told him that I had never wanted his money or his gratitude, only his respect, and that respect is not a favor you grant your mother when it happens to be convenient. And it is the foundation you stand on, and he and Vanessa had built their entire comfortable life on sand, on the assumption that I would give and never ask, and that I would absorb any humiliation and keep cooking Sunday dinner. I told him I loved him more than my own life, and that was exactly why I could no longer let him treat me as less than a person. And I said that if he wanted a mother, he would have to learn to see one. Daniel wept at my table that afternoon like he hadn't since he was a child. We came to an arrangement in the end, and I did not want to ruin them, only to wake them. I forgave a portion of the debt in exchange for their honesty and a repayment plan on the rest, one that required Daniel to sit down and truly understand where every dollar of his life had come from. The house was sold and they moved somewhere honest, somewhere they could actually afford. And Vanessa and I will never be close, but the last time I saw her, she called me Eleanor, and she said it carefully, like a woman who had finally learned my name. I am 71 now. I rebuilt my retirement savings more slowly than I lost them, but I rebuilt them, and this time they are mine and no one else's. Daniel comes by on Sundays, not to be fed, but to see me, and sometimes he cooks badly, and I let him, because watching my son learn to serve instead of be served is worth more than any dinner I ever made. I have learned, late but not too late, that love without respect is just servitude with a kinder name. I gave my whole life to being needed. What I have now, finally, is being valued, and I will never again mistake one for the other. My name is Raymond Doyle, and I built my house with these two hands over 2 summers in 1979, back when a man could still frame a home himself if he had the will and the shoulders for it. I remember the smell of fresh-cut pine, the ache in my back at the end of each day, the way the sun would drop behind the ridge while I hammered one last board into place before the light gave out. My wife, Margaret, would bring me lemonade and stand there with her hands on her hips, telling me the porch was crooked, and it was, a little, but we never fixed it because that crookedness became ours. She planted the garden along the south wall, roses and tomatoes, and a stubborn lilac bush that outlived nearly everything else. Our 2 children, Kevin and Sharon, took their first steps on that porch. I taught them to ride bikes in that driveway. That house wasn't a building to me. It was 46 years of a life. Every scuff on the floor, a memory. Every creak in the stairs, a familiar voice. When Margaret passed 4 years ago, quietly in our bed on a Sunday morning, the house became the last place on earth that still held her, so I stayed. I kept the garden as best I could, and though my knees weren't what they'd been, and my memory would occasionally misplace a name or a set of keys, the ordinary forgetting of a man past 70. And my children began to visit more often after their mother died, and I mistook their frequency for tenderness. Kevin, my son, had always been ambitious in a restless, dissatisfied way, forever chasing a bigger house, a better car, a life that stayed just out of reach. Sharon had married a man who spent faster than he earned. I saw these things, but I didn't let myself understand them. A father doesn't want to believe his children are counting his years like a man counting change. They came to me together one evening, which should have been my first warning, because they rarely agreed on anything. They sat me down at my own kitchen table, the one Margaret and I had eaten at for 4 decades, and they told me they were worried about my knees on the stairs, worried about my memory, about me forgetting the stove on, about me falling with no one to hear. They'd found a place, he said, a nice facility, clean and safe, with people to look after me. Kevin's voice was gentle and Sharon held my hand, and I felt, God help me, grateful. I felt lucky to have children who loved me enough to worry. They put papers in front of me, a power of attorney, and explained it was just practical, and just so they could help manage things if my memory got worse, so they could handle the little details and let me rest. I trusted them the way you trust the people you raised. I signed. I signed away more than I knew. The facility was called Sunny Meadows, though I never saw a meadow, only a parking lot and a courtyard with plastic chairs. My room was beige, all of it beige, the walls, the bedding, the curtains, and it smelled of antiseptic and something underneath the antiseptic that I came to recognize as the smell of people waiting to die. And I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd adjust. I set Margaret's photograph on the nightstand and I tried to make peace with the walls closing in. I was 70 years old and I believed my children had done a hard, loving thing for my own good. That belief lasted 2 weeks. My grandson, Tyler, Kevin's boy, came to visit on a Saturday. He was 11, a good kid, still young enough that the world hadn't taught him to lie smoothly. We were sitting in the courtyard and he was telling me about school, and then, without any idea what he was doing, he asked me if I was sad about the house being sold. I asked him what he meant, and Tyler, bless him, told me the whole thing without knowing it was a knife. And He said his dad and Aunt Sharon had put the house up for sale, that there'd been people walking through it taking pictures, that his dad said they were going to split the money and Tyler might get a bigger bedroom in a new place. He said it cheerfully. He had no idea, and I sat there in that plastic chair with the antiseptic smell in my nose and felt the ground fall away beneath me. They had done it. 2 weeks. They hadn't even waited 2 weeks. And while I unpacked my socks into a beige dresser, my children had listed the house I built with my hands. The house their mother's roses still grew against, and they'd already been dividing the money before I'd finished settling into the room they'd stored me in. The power of attorney I'd signed, believing it was about my safety, had been the key they needed to sell my life out from under me. And the reasons they'd given, my knees, my memory, my safety, had been the story they told to make it look merciful. And they hadn't put me in a home because I couldn't manage. They'd put me in a home so they could sell the house while I wasn't there to stop them. That night I did not sleep, but somewhere in those dark hours, I stopped being a grateful old man and became a careful one. I had spent my whole working life around men who understood contracts and rights, 30 years in the pipe fitters union, and I knew that a signature obtained through deception was not the ironclad thing my children imagined. More than that, I knew people. I still had friends from the old days, and one of them, a man named Sol Berman, had gone from the trades to law school late in life and become a sharp attorney who never forgot that I'd once lent him the money to bury his father when he had nothing. And I called Sol from the payphone in the facility's lobby because they'd been slow to let me have my own phone, and I told him everything. There was a long silence on the line, and then Sol said, in that gravel voice of his, that they had made a serious mistake and that we were going to make them understand exactly how serious. And the thing about a power of attorney signed on the premise that a man is losing his mind is that it collapses entirely if the man's mind turns out to be perfectly sound. And Sol arranged for me to be evaluated by an independent physician, a full cognitive assessment, the kind that can't be argued with. I sat through hours of questions and tests, and when it was done, the doctor wrote a clear, unambiguous report stating that I was of completely sound mind, no dementia, no significant cognitive impairment, entirely capable of managing my own affairs. And that single document turned everything around. My children had built their whole scheme on the claim that I couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions, and now a medical expert had put in writing that they were wrong. Sol filed to revoke the power of attorney and moved immediately to halt the sale of the house. Turned out the sale hadn't closed yet, was still in the paperwork stage, and once the buyer's agent received a formal notice that the property had been listed without the true owner's informed consent, under a power of attorney now under legal challenge, the whole thing fell apart. Buyers don't want a house tangled in a family lawsuit. The sale collapsed. And then Sol did one more thing, the thing I'll remember to my last day. And he gathered the family. He called a meeting, ostensibly to discuss my care, and Kevin and Sharon came, still thinking they held the upper hand, still wearing those concerned expressions. And in front of everyone, in front of their spouses, and even in front of a red-faced Tyler, who was old enough now to sense something had gone terribly wrong, Sol laid out the medical report timeline, the listing dated 12 days after they'd committed me, the proof of what they had done. And I watched my children's faces as the truth was spread out on the table where they couldn't laugh it away or soften it with gentle voices. And Kevin went pale and started to sputter about how it was for my own good. And I looked at him, my son, and I asked him one question. I asked him if his mother would have been proud of what he'd done. And he couldn't answer. He couldn't even meet my eyes. Sharon started to cry, but they were the tears of someone caught, not someone sorry, and I'd lived long enough to know the difference. And I didn't shout at them. I didn't need to. I simply told them, quietly, that the man who had taught them to be honest still remembered how it was done, and that they had forgotten I was their teacher before I was ever their burden. I moved back into my house that same month. The garden had gone to weeds in the weeks I'd been away, and Margaret's roses tangled and thirsty, the lilac drooping, but the foundation, the one I'd poured myself in the summer of 1979, was as solid as the day I set it. And I spent that first afternoon on my knees in the dirt, pulling weeds, my bad knees be damned, and I swear I could feel Margaret standing on the crooked porch behind me, hands on her hips, and telling me I'd let her garden go to ruin. I told her I was sorry, I told her I was home. Kevin and I don't speak much now. Sharon sends cards on holidays that I don't answer. End. Some betrayals are too deep to be smoothed over with a greeting card, and I've made my peace with that. But Tyler visits me, and I made sure he understood that none of what happened was his fault, that a boy who tells the truth without knowing it is more honest than grown men who lie with full knowledge. I changed my will, of course, and the house and what little I have will go to Tyler when he's grown, held in trust, and to the union's scholarship fund for young apprentices, starting out the way I once did. And my own children wrote themselves out of it the day they tried to sell my life while I slept in a beige room. I'm 74 now, and I still climb those stairs every night, slowly, in hand, on the rail Margaret and I installed together. My knees ache and my memory drops a name here and there, the way any man's does. But I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly what I built, and no one will ever again convince me to sign it away with a gentle voice and a worried face. The house still stands. The lilac came back the next spring, stubborn as ever, and the foundation, mine and the house's both, held firm through everything they tried to do to it. That, in the end, is the only inheritance that ever mattered. And my name is Arthur Delaney, and I was the youngest of three, which in my family meant I was the one whose grief was treated as a scheduling inconvenience. When our father died, and I was 54 years old, a grown man with grey in my beard, and my two older brothers, Gerald and Vincent, still spoke to me as though I were the boy who'd trailed behind them in the yard. Dad had built a modest fortune over his lifetime, nothing extravagant, but a paid-off house, a portfolio he'd tended carefully, and a lake cabin up north that had been in the family for 3 generations. More than the money, though, there was the cabin, and there was the understanding, and, spoken at every holiday for as long as I could remember, that Dad wanted things divided fairly among his 3 sons. The morning after the funeral, before I had even washed the grief from my face, Gerald called and told me not to worry about the paperwork. He and Vincent would handle everything, he said, because I was too emotional to think clearly, and they didn't want me burdening myself. I remember feeling almost grateful. I was emotional. Dad and I had been close in a way my brothers never quite were, and the loss had hollowed me out, so I let them handle it, and I let the 2 men who had spent their whole lives managing me manage this too. The reading of the will took place in Gerald's living room rather than a lawyer's office, which should have been my first warning. Gerald sat at the head of the room with a folder, Vincent beside him nodding along, and me on the couch like a guest in my own family's grief. Gerald handed me a document and explained the arrangements in a smooth, practiced voice. The house would go to him, since he was the eldest, and had always been closest to Dad's affairs. The investment portfolio would go to Vincent to manage on behalf of the family. And to me, Gerald said with a small sympathetic smile, Dad had left the sentimental items, the photo albums, Dad's old watch, a box of letters, things, he said, that he knew meant more to me than money ever could. I looked down at the paper in my hands and realized it was a photocopy. Not the original will, a photocopy, the text slightly grey, the signature a flat reproduction. When I asked to see the original, Gerald waved his hand and said it was with the lawyer and being processed and that I shouldn't trouble myself. Vincent added gently that I should be glad Dad had thought of me at all, given how impractical I'd always been with money. And there it was, the old family script, the one where I was the sentimental child who couldn't be trusted with anything real. I left that day with a box of letters and a watch, and a sick feeling I couldn't name. For a week I tried to talk myself out of it. These were my brothers, surely they wouldn't. But the photocopy nagged at me, and the more I thought about it, the more the whole performance felt rehearsed. Dad had been a meticulous man. He'd told me more than once, sitting on the dock at the lake cabin with a beer in his hand, that the three of us would share everything equally, that he'd made sure of it, that he never wanted his boys fighting over money after he was gone. Those weren't the words of a man who'd leave 2 sons a fortune and the third a shoebox of letters. So I did something my brothers never expected the sentimental one to do. I hired my own lawyer, a sharp, quiet woman named Priya Raman, who listened to my whole story without interrupting and then asked one simple question. Had I ever seen the original will? I hadn't. And she nodded slowly and said that in her experience, when a will is read from a photocopy and the original is conveniently unavailable, it is worth finding out why. She filed a formal request through the probate court for the original document to be produced, the real one, with the real signature, lodged where the law required it to be lodged. What we found unraveled everything. The will Gerald had read from was real in the sense that it existed, but it was an old draft, one Dad had written years earlier and later replaced. The current, legally valid will, the one Dad had signed with proper witnesses 18 months before his death and filed with his actual attorney, said something entirely different. It divided everything, the house, the portfolio, the lake cabin, equally among his 3 sons, exactly as he'd always promised. Gerald and Vincent had found the old draft in Dad's papers and recognized that it happened to favor them and simply chosen to present it as the final word, betting that their emotional little brother would never think to check. I sat in Priya's office holding the real will, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Not rage, exactly. A kind of cold clarity. My brothers hadn't just tried to cheat me out of money. They had used my grief, my love for our father, my whole lifetime of being underestimated as the very tool to rob me. They'd counted on me being too broken and too soft to fight back. They had, in the cruelest possible way, weaponized the fact that I'd loved Dad more openly than they ever had. Priya advised me to let the court do the talking, and I did. When the original will was validated and Gerald and Vincent were formally notified that their arrangement was void, the phone call started, and this time the smoothness was gone from Gerald's voice. He accused me of tearing the family apart over money, which was a remarkable thing to hear from the man who'd tried to keep 2/3 of it for himself. Vincent tried a softer approach, showing up at my door with a bottle of Dad's favorite whiskey, talking about how we shouldn't let lawyers come between brothers. I let him say his piece. Then I asked him whether he'd have shown up with whiskey if I'd simply accepted the box of letters and gone quietly. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The estate was divided the way our father had actually intended, into 3 equal shares. I took my third of the house's value, my third of the portfolio, and my share of the lake cabin. And here is where I surprised even myself. I didn't want to own that cabin jointly with 2 men who had tried to steal it from me, so I bought out their shares at fair market value, using my portion of the estate. The place that held 3 generations of Delaney Summers became mine alone, legally and completely. Gerald and Vincent took their money, and I took the dock where Dad and I had sat with our beers, and the loon calls at dusk, and the memory of a father who had, it turned out, kept his promise to me all along. I don't see my brothers anymore. Gerald sends the occasional stiff email around the holidays. Vincent has gone silent entirely, nursing the particular resentment of a man who was caught and has decided the real crime was being caught. I've made my peace with the distance. Some bonds, once you see clearly what the other person was willing to do to you, cannot be unseen. But I go up to the lake every summer now. I sit on that dock in the evening, and sometimes I take out the box of letters, the sentimental items my brothers thought were a consolation prize, and I read Dad's handwriting, and I understand something they never will. They fought over the money because the money was all they'd ever really valued. Dad left me the letters because he knew I'd understand what they were worth. In the end, got exactly what they deserved, and so, at last, did I. My name is Rosa Aguilar, and for 11 years I ran the family restaurant that my daughter-in-law would eventually try to take from me with a smile and a lawyer. The restaurant was called Casa Aguilar, a small place on a corner in a neighborhood that had watched it grow from a taco cart into an institution. My late husband, Manuel, and I had built it from nothing, and after he passed, I kept it alive on my own, rising before dawn to make the masa by hand, staying past midnight to close the books. It wasn't just a business. It was the thing that had raised my son Eduardo, put him through college, and given our name meaning on that street. Eduardo married Claudia when he was 30. She was ambitious, well-dressed, with a business degree and a way of looking around my restaurant that I mistook, at first, for admiration. She started coming in to help, reorganizing the menus, suggesting we raise prices, telling me the kitchen was inefficient. I welcomed it. I was getting older. My knees ached from decades on the tile floor, and I thought foolishly that here was family who wanted to lift some of the weight from my shoulders. I began letting Claudia handle more of the paperwork, the ordering, the bank deposits, and Eduardo assured me she was good with numbers, that I could finally rest a little. I trusted them both with the thing I loved most in the world. The trouble began quietly. Claudia suggested we formalize the ownership structure, put the business into a proper company with clear paperwork so that everything would be protected in case something happened to me. She spoke about my age a great deal, always gently, always framed as concern. She brought documents to the restaurant during the slow afternoon hours, spread them on a table by the window, and pointed to where I should sign. I trusted her. My eyes weren't good for small print anymore, and she read the important parts aloud in a soothing voice, telling me it made me the head of the company, that it protected my legacy. I signed. God forgive me, I signed. And what I had actually signed made Claudia the majority shareholder of the company that now owned Casa Aguilar. She had structured it so that she held controlling interest, with Eduardo as a minor partner, and me, the woman who had built the place with her own 2 hands, reduced to a small stake and an honorary title. Founder, the papers called me. A word that means nothing when someone else holds the votes. I didn't understand what had happened until the day Claudia informed me, over coffee she poured in my own restaurant, that the company had decided to modernize the brand, and that my presence in the kitchen was no longer necessary. She wanted to bring in a trained chef, change the menu, and turn my family's recipes into something for the food magazines, and she wanted me to step aside gracefully to enjoy my retirement. I sat there in the restaurant Manuel and I had built, and being told by a woman who had married into our name that I was no longer needed in it. Eduardo wouldn't meet my eyes. He mumbled something about how it was a good business decision, and how Claudia knew what she was doing, how I should be proud to see the place grow. My own son, standing in a room that existed because of my sacrifices, siding with the woman who was erasing me. And I went home that night, and I wept the way I hadn't wept since Manuel died. But somewhere in that weeping, the grief hardened into something else. Because I remembered something Claudia, with all her degrees, had never bothered to learn, the recipes. The recipes were mine, not written down in any company document, not filed with any lawyer, but held in my head and my hands, in the way my mother had held them, and her mother before her. The mole that took 3 days, the masa ground the old way, the sauces that customers drove across the city for. Claudia had taken the company, the name on the paperwork, the votes and the shares. But she could not sign a document that transferred 40 years of knowledge from my hands into hers. Either. The soul of Casa Aguilar had never been on any page she'd made me sign. I said nothing. I let her push me out. I let her bring in her trained chef and her modern menu and her magazine photographers. And I waited. Within 3 months, the reviews began to turn, and long-time customers complained that the food wasn't the same. The mole was wrong. The tamales had lost something. The neighborhood that had loved Casa Aguilar for a generation could taste, and immediately, that the heart had gone out of it. Business fell. The trained chef, working from Claudia's guesses at my recipes, couldn't reproduce what he'd never been taught. And Claudia had the company, but she didn't have the thing that made the company worth anything. Meanwhile, I had not been idle. 2 doors down, a small storefront had gone vacant, and, with the modest savings Manuel and I had kept separate all those years, money Claudia had never known about, I quietly signed a lease. I did not use the Aguilar name, which now legally belonged to the company. I called the new place Cocina de Rosa, Rosa's Kitchen, and I began at 68 years old to cook again the real way, the only way I knew. And the neighborhood found me within a week. Word travels fast on a street like ours. The customers who had grown up on my food followed the taste, not the sign, and they lined up outside Cocina de Rosa, while 2 doors down, Casa Aguilar sat half empty with its beautiful modern menu that no one wanted. Claudia had taken the shell and left me with the substance, and she'd been certain the shell was what mattered. She learned, too late, that a name is only worth what stands behind it. And Casa Aguilar closed within the year. Claudia's grand modernization had run a beloved institution into the ground in a matter of months. And the company she'd fought so hard to control became a company that owned nothing but a shuttered storefront and a debt. Eduardo came to me then, finally, humbled, standing in the doorway of my new kitchen with his hands in his pockets like a boy. He apologized. He said he'd been weak, that he'd let Claudia convince him it was all for the best. I looked at my son for a long moment. Then I handed him an apron and told him that if he wanted to be part of this family's kitchen again, he could start by washing dishes. The way I had when I was young, he took the apron. He's still there, learning the recipes properly this time, the way they're meant to be passed down, hand to hand, and not through any lawyer's document. Claudia and I do not speak. She left Eduardo not long after the money ran out, which told me everything about what she'd married him for in the first place. I am 70 now, and my knees still ache, and I still rise before dawn to make the masa. Cocina de Rosa is thriving. The name on the sign is different, but the food is exactly the same, because I am the same, and I always was the thing they couldn't take. They tried to steal my legacy by stealing my restaurant. Never understood that the legacy was never the building. It was me. It was always me.